Welcome, everyone. We are so happy to have you and to have you join us today for the second part of this two-part webinar on supporting children and families from Afghanistan. I know we are right at the hour, but we have a lot that we want to cover today, so we're going to jump in. Today we are getting started with just some of the Zoom functions that I'm sure y'all are pro at by now, but just as a reminder, you all are admitted in listen only mode, but you can use the chat function below by clicking that chat bubble icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to communicate with other participants, panelists, and the host, those of us that care behind the screen here. You can also click the raise hand icon if you'd like to be taken off mute to ask a question verbally during the Q&A portion at the end. But in the meantime, as questions come up, you are invited to type them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll address them either by typing a response there or verbally answering towards the end of the session. You are also able to click the thumbs up button to vote for another participant's question. And finally, you can turn on closed captions by clicking the CC or live transcript icon, where you'll have a choice between subtitles or a full transcript that can pop up. These are automated, so please be aware that there might be some errors, but they hopefully will provide some support if needed. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with us, before we get into the content, I wanted to do just a brief welcome and overview. The Center for Adjustment, Resilience, and Recovery, or CARE, is a project of the International Rescue Committee. Our aim at CARE is to bridge between agencies that specialize in serving individuals and families who have experienced forced displacement and mental health providers and traumatic stress experts, so that through our shared knowledge and collaboration, more children and families who have experienced forced displacement can get the supports that they need to heal, adjust, and thrive. So we're really excited to be here today to talk to you about kind of the second part of this two-part series that we have. Our objectives for today's webinar are threefold. We are hoping that you all will walk away with an understanding of best practices in approaching the mental health and psychosocial support needs of displaced people, that you will feel confident in identifying culturally and trauma-informed care practices to better engage with and serve Afghan children, families, and individuals. And you'll feel like you have an increased awareness and knowledge of the strengths and resources that Afghan children, families, and individuals have, and how the mental health and psychosocial support services can support these resilient capabilities. Now, we are joined by partners from three wonderful organizations and institutions. First, there's me, just because I'm talking now. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Dalpy. I am our project director at CARE at the International Rescue Committee. So you'll hear a little bit from me, but we have wonderful partners from the Afghan Family Strengthening Team, comprised of colleagues from Boston College and the University of Illinois, Chicago. We have Dr. Teresa Betancourt, Dr. Mary Bunn, Dr. Eugene Jung, and Farhad Sharifi joining us, and we'll be hearing from them shortly. We are also joined by Ariane Mahmoud Ghazi. She's a licensed clinical social worker who, among many other roles, is the Afghan Resettlement Project Clinical Supervisor at Las Cumbres Community Services in New Mexico. We also have the wonderful members of our CARE team helping us with the chat and the Q&A. We have Giuseppe Mercuri, Marwa Masarani, and Beth Farmer manning all of those. So we have a wonderful team here that you will get to hear from and engage with in the chat and in the Q&A functions. So without further ado, we're going to dive in. I'm going to start us off just by talking broadly and briefly about some best practices in approaching mental health and psychosocial support services, or MHPSS services, which we're actually going to center a little bit on the MHPSS pyramid, which was developed by the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a global coordinating and collaborative body for humanitarian aid providers. So we're going to use this a bit as a framework to think about as we are going to hear about practical examples of what these services look like in practice as we're serving and supporting Afghan families, children, and individuals. So here's the base of the pyramid. The pyramid's base is really focused on those basic services and security. This is the foundation of all humanitarian work and often makes up much of the initial response to crises. This is really focused on that promotion of safety and services to both respond to and prevent distress and experiences of violence or traumatic experiences. What we know from both the research and practice is that conflict and displacement tend to erode many of the protective structures and supports that are in place for children and families, while it adds an entire set of stressors, drivers, and triggers for distress and violence. So these basic services and securities are imperative in the process of preventing further toxic stress and trauma. Our initial, most common, and most impactful approach at this point is to really ensure that children, families, and individuals have access to basic services and security such as food, shelter, and medical care. This is much of what has happened at the base response, as we covered in part 1 of this series, and is continuing to happen in that initial post-base response with some of those basic services in supporting families and getting set up in their new communities. Once that initial stabilization and safety is achieved or beginning to be achieved, right, we can look at focusing on adjustment support in connection to community, meaning and purpose, and coping strategies and skills. This encompasses the next 2 levels of the pyramid. So this yellow one, and then we're going to see another one coming up. But for the second level, the yellow one that we see here, we often will explore such questions in the work as what conditions are in place to help establish routines, to find social support and community, and to engage in positive activities. This phase, this kind of level of the pyramid will look different for each community, for each child, and each family, and can often include things such as coffee and tea rituals, connection to faith-based communities, and a reestablishment of educational activities. As we continue to move up this pyramid, the interventions tend to become more intensive, more focused, and are requested or needed by fewer people based on experiences or identities. As we continue to the next stage, which is focused, non-specialized services, we tend to include things like comprehensive case management, traditional healing practices, and non-therapeutic group interventions for individuals with either shared identities or experiences, such as groups for women, groups for adolescents, or groups for caregivers and parents. And finally, at the very top, we have focused, specialized clinical supports, such as formalized, culturally adapted psychotherapeutic models and clinical care for persistent and severe mental health symptoms. For many of the non-specialized providers, like a lot of refugee resettlement providers who I know are joining us, the work for this level tends to focus on entry points for destigmatizing and providing psychoeducation within the common entry points for the specialized services, so that those of us who work in the refugee resettlement sphere are able to effectively connect people to that higher level of care within our partner organizations and agencies. So as I said, that was our kind of very quick centering in kind of this framework and the way that we're looking at mental health and psychosocial support services. But we really are going to focus on hearing about illustrative examples of what this work looks like in practice from our colleagues and in support of recent Afghan arrivals. So first, we're going to have our colleagues Teresa Betancourt, Mary Bunn, Yujin Young, and Farhad Sharifi to talk a little bit more about promoting family stabilization through their project. So I will pass it over to you all.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was wonderful, and setting us off with the MHPSS pyramid is really helpful because you'll see where we map along that. So I'm Teresa Betancourt, and I'm just going to kick us off by saying a little bit about the history of the family strengthening intervention, which has actually been underway since early collaborations in the Boston area with different refugee groups starting in 2004, 2005. So the intervention we'll talk about today, the family strengthening intervention, is based on the work of Dr. Bill Beardsley and his Family Talk intervention. It's an evidence-based, family-based preventative program originally developed for the prevention of depression and the offspring of depressed caregivers. Why we initially were very interested in thinking about this for war-affected populations and displaced populations is it was always developed to be deployment-focused, to be done by non-specialists, by a wide range of providers. You could have a higher level of training and a professional mental health degree into it, but you could also be a Head Start worker. He's done it with tribal communities. It's a family-based preventative model that's done by home visitors, can also be done at an agency setting if needed, that really focuses on the strengths of the family, enhancing the parent-child relationship, improve communication to help families adapt to different life transitions. In his case, depression. We adopted the same intervention, took it to Rwanda and adapted it for families affected by HIV. And then when we were contacted to help Somali Bantu resettling refugees in the Boston area, we saw this model we had been using in sub-Saharan Africa as a very strong one for working with resettled refugee populations. So just a little bit of the history, because I really want to get to the Afghan work. This began, as I mentioned, 2004, 2005, when the public schools were experiencing a large influx of a different refugee population, that was the Somali Bantu here in the Boston area. We did a mixed methods, community-based participatory assessment, training local refugees as researchers in their community to ask about the problems of youth. These are methods we've now used with the Afghans, and also the strengths of families and communities that we could build on in intervention models. We realized that a real innovation that needed to happen is that we can't continue to create these highly culturally adapted interventions that are just for one migrant or a refugee group. So we expanded the research then to invite Bhutanese refugees who are also resettling in Chelsea. And we wrote a grant to the National Institutes of Minority Health and Health Disparities. We were funded for a first pilot grant, which we have the results of. And then we just recently finished a very well-powered effectiveness trial, and I'll tell you a bit about that. Based on our experience in working in two communities with community health workers and non-specialists doing the home visiting who come from the refugee background, speak English, but also speak their local languages, know the culture, we then began to work with Afghan communities and have done some initial assessment that we'll talk about today. And we've adapted the intervention and are going to pilot with the Afghan communities this summer. So just to give you a little background on what I'm referring to when I say community-based participatory research, this means not only are we hiring people from the community, both to be the home visitors, but also to help us do the research on the impact of the intervention. We also are consulting with community advisory boards at every step, youth advisory board, parent advisory boards from both communities, and we'll do the same thing in our plans with the Afghan population this summer. The idea is an intervention that's done by refugees for refugees and research done by refugees for refugees. So just to give you an overview of the intervention, it has 10 modules. We flow from early assessment sessions with the caregivers. This can be different family configurations. It's meant to be flexible, understanding the unique strengths and unique challenges of that family, and really trying to understand our potential active ingredients for helping this particular family. We also have sessions where the home visitor meets with the children twice, and then we return to parent sessions to prepare for our culminating family meeting, which is one of the core components of the intervention. And it's something that a lot of families go on to repeat, is hosting family meetings to communicate about family challenges and how to overcome them. Another core component of the intervention is the family narrative, which is a strengths-based narrative, the story of the family, where they came from, how they started, what they've been through together, what they've come to learn about the unique strengths of their families, and how that also helps them look towards the future and where they want to go as a family. And so this is done by a home visitor, and it's a weekly session, about 90 minutes on average. Just briefly, I'd like to mention a little bit of the research that we've done. I mentioned that we've published a pilot study. We've just completed the effectiveness implementation study, looking at different models for integrating this within two community organizations. This is done with Somali Bantu and Bhutanese refugees, so I'll just show you a little bit on what we learned. We did see from the published pilot trial, we're happy to share this. It's in the Journal of Adolescent Health, and that may have been sent around. This was a randomized design. So out of 80 families, you had half of them getting usual care in the community, and then half of them got usual care plus a home visitor from their community who was well trained and supervised to do the family strengthening intervention with them. We did see pre to post intervention significant reductions in traumatic stress reactions as reported by children. We also saw caregivers reporting a decrease in depression symptoms in children. For Bhutanese, we saw a decrease in conduct problems. That was not the same for the Somali Bantu, but we'll see again in a larger, better powered study if that trend continues. And we did see a significant reduction in family arguing in the Bhutanese families. We also saw very high levels of feasibility. So people thought, you know, because it was home visiting, because the person knew their language and culture, it was feasible to do, and very high satisfaction and acceptability. People saying they would recommend it to friends, they would do it again. And I just wanted to mention briefly this effectiveness study that involves 186 Bhutanese community members and 168 Somali Bantu. And I just wanted to underscore that we can work with these sorts of models with community health workers with a variety of different types of families. And that's what's exciting in thinking about bringing this to the Afghan population. You see here in these two communities, very different family size, Somali Bantu households being much larger, less citizenship status in the Bhutanese. That's a stressor for the Bhutanese population, less so for the Somali Bantu. But then again, for the Somali Bantu, issues with literacy and especially mothers having a challenge in parenting teenagers where they speak Mai, the kids are learning English in the public schools. So it's meant to be flexible, it's meant to be adapted to different cultures, and that's what we're now doing with the Afghan partnership. So I'll turn it over to Mary.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Teresa. My name is Mary Bunn, and I'm delighted to be telling you about our Afghan Family Strengthening Initiative, which really builds on this decade-plus work that Teresa's just described to develop and test the family strengthening intervention for other refugee communities. You know, this was very timely and important given that we know that out of approximately 80,000 Afghans who've been recently evacuated, about 40% of those are families with school-aged children. So this really presented a great opportunity to build on the family strengthening intervention and to engage in a very rigorous community-driven process and cultural adaptation process with a goal of meeting the needs of Afghan families very early on in the resettlement process, which is quite a unique experience, you know, in the refugee social service ecology. Next slide. I want to just say briefly that the project is multi-phase. Today we'll principally be talking to you about this phase one of the work, which involved conducting trauma-informed family-based assessments at safe havens and engaging in a cultural adaptation process in order to get the intervention ready for Afghan families and communities. But just wanted you to have a sense of the broader project as well, which then also involves pilot testing, which we'll talk briefly about. And ultimately we hope multi-state implementation and collaborations with partners at Refugee Service Organization and state leadership. And we hope eventually being able to really expand access to the family strengthening intervention for refugees to other diverse refugee communities as well. Just a bit of background in terms of our approach to adapting the intervention. We're using a framework called Adapted, which is simply a methodology for adapting evidence-based interventions for use with new populations and new service settings. And this is set up as a kind of sequential and iterative process that begins with an assessment of needs to identify the priority problems and issues that need addressing in a given community and to help with the selection of intervention. And then the next phase is a cultural consultation process whereby the intervention is reviewed by a group of key stakeholders and cultural experts to identify areas of modification that'll be needed in order to make the intervention suitable to a new population. And then this ultimately results in an adapted model, at least a first version of the adapted model that can then be pilot tested with the new community. So we're going to talk with you about both the assessments of needs we conducted as well as the cultural consultation process. So in order to assess child and family needs, and what you're seeing here are community health workers who worked with us at the Fort McCoy, Wisconsin Safe Haven location, who literally went door to door to the military barracks where Afghan families were living in order to conduct these qualitative methods of free listing and key informant interviews with a goal of identifying the priority problems, needs, strengths, and culturally specific mental health issues of Afghan children and families. In total, we conducted 117 of these free listing and key informant interviews with both adults and children, and males and females. And the principal questions that we asked children and families are listed here. What are the problems of children around here? What do families do to support children with these problems? And what formal services do families need to support with these problems? So we're interested not just in problems, but also in the strengths inherent within families and the community at large, and which ultimately then can be leveraged through interventions to help stabilize and support families. So what you're seeing here, and we've laid this out according to that nice IASD framework that Jess kicked us off with today, is that we identified problems across the whole service pyramid. Starting at that first foundational level, those problems principally had to do with environmental and resource problems specific to the safe haven locations. We identified, actually at the time we were there, limited routinized formal educational opportunities and safety concerns, as well as problems with being able to access culturally appropriate foods, clothing, and other basic materials to help people feel safe. Moving up the pyramid, we also identified problems related to naturally losses and changes in social relationships, and lots of concerns related to immigration and imminent relocation problems. Moving up another notch, we did identify a number of family-focused problems, principally parenting problems, problems related to parental monitoring, some of which were again, specific to the safe haven location, and then concerns related to family violence. And then finally, moving to that upper end of the pyramid, we did identify what we call problems with thinking, feeling, and behavior, using that non-stigmatizing language of thinking, feeling, and behavior rather than using a term mental health. And now we're just going to talk very briefly about some of those findings related to problems with thinking, feeling, and behavior among Afghan children. So we looked at what you're looking at here as a chart that first identifies the kind of problem cluster, and then the second column identifies the culturally specific indicators that are associated with those problems. And then the third column identifies what Afghan key informants saw to be the perceived causes of these problems. So we identified 5 main groups. The first were conduct and behavioral type problems. These were things such as fighting or children who had so-called bad manners. The second problem group were sadness and depression-like problems, feeling bored, crying, depressed, etc. Loss and grief-like problems, missing people, wanting to go home. Trauma-like or safety-related problems such as feeling unsafe, don't trust people, and then worry and anxiety-like problems. Thinking a lot was one of the most commonly identified culturally specific indicators. In terms of strengths, family strengths, we identified family communication practices, particularly telling stories, reading together, spending time together, teaching children and supporting their learning. Supporting children, acknowledging this is a transitional and difficult time and having patience with children, playing in social activities, and attending to children's basic needs as some of the primary family strengths that were relied upon to overcome these challenges that children were having. So the findings from this formative assessment period at the Safe Haven led us to believe that a prevention-oriented intervention that really targeted problems with family functioning and also leveraged these kinds of family strengths, which were emblematic of the family strengthening intervention for refugees, could be very valuable for incoming Afghan families, and that they could benefit from such an intervention, particularly early on in the resettlement process. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Farhad, who's going to tell you a bit about the cultural adaptation process.
Thank you, Mary. I know that we don't have much time. My name is Farhad Sharifi from Afghanistan. I'm a recent evacuee myself. I'm a social worker, and now I have the opportunity to be part of this great team. Yes, with regard with the regards to the area of adaptation, I shall say that we had regular weekly meetings over a period of almost 4 months, which myself, Dr. Eugene, Teresa, Mary, 2 previous interventionists, and 2 social work interns, we were meeting, and then we were going through module by module to see the content and to see if the content is appropriate for Afghan culture, and or we need to adapt or modify some of that, which we did. Overall, though we felt that the modifications were minimal, but we could not escape the role of Dari and Pashto language and some other cultural consideration when we were reviewing the content. So basically, we tried to simplify the terminologies throughout the manual, especially when we were speaking about the mental health and psychoeducation topics. So to avoid the technical vocabulary due to first the stigma around these terminologies, and second, to keep in mind that the module shall be understandable for all families, regardless of their educational level. For example, immediately after some of the terminologies, we added the local language equivalent wording or a script, so that it will be easy for the interventionists to communicate the proper meaning of the term. We augmented some of the content on family and couples conflict management. We modified almost all the names in the vignettes and make it more familiar to someone from Afghanistan to relate. We also added some of the relevant cultural literature appropriate for the topics we had in some of the modules, like topics on resiliency and patience. And in the education module, we emphasized the parents' rights to talk to the school managements about the supplementary and dietary needs. For example, their children need a prayer room, as these are of high importance for Muslim families. We are also careful on topics which might be considered taboo in Afghan culture, like the discussion on the issue of too much drinking, on puberty, co-education, and dating. These were among what we call hard conversation that families might have. So we want to have a safe space for such conversation in the families. Besides, also we had translations of consent forms and questionnaires. So these were the basics that I could share here concisely. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and I'm Yujin Zhang. We have a very exciting pilot under preparation right now, funded by WKK Foundation. We are planning to pilot test our adopted FSIR with 30 Afghan families living in Maine. And we are working very closely with one of the resettlement organization, Maine Immigrants and Refugee Services. We call them mayors. And we are planning to hire 6 interventionists, 6 Afghan research assistants, and like all of them are Afghans, by the way. And they will be trained by one of the previous Somali Bantu refugee interventionists who will play a significant role as training and quality improvement support.
Great, thank you, Eugene. Just to close our presentation today, what we wanted to review is some of the requirements of partners that'll be conducting the pilot in Maine, but also of future partners who might be involved in this multi-state community implementation. In terms, and some of this has been discussed over the course of our time today, in terms of the FSIR interventionists or home visitors. Those are previously resettled Afghan men and women who speak and read Dari, Pashto, and English and have strong interpersonal skills. You'll notice that having specialized knowledge of mental health is not a requirement. As Teresa said at the beginning, this is an intervention that was designed particularly for delivery by lay or community providers. In terms of the service partners, those are social service or health or refugee health organizations that have on-site clinical supervision who can support the FSIR interventionists and have an established referral network, particularly important for triaging high need cases that are identified over the course of the intervention. So in closing, we just want to thank you for hearing about our work with Afghan families and look forward to the question and answer period. In the next slide, we've shared our contact information, and please feel free to follow up with us after today if there's any additional questions you have about the intervention or the Family Strengthening Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It was such an amazing amount of information that we were able to get on the family strengthening intervention for refugees and how it fits into that kind of level of the focused non-specialized supports to be able to really support families through this incredibly difficult time. Really appreciate you sharing all of the work that you've done around the cultural adaptation and those needs assessments that you've been conducting. Now we're going to, I'm very pleased to welcome another colleague, Ariane Mahmoud Ghazi, to talk a little bit more about relational reflections and community connections as part of serving the Afghan community in New Mexico. So Ariane, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. So grateful to hear about this the skeletal structure of something that can be just fleshed out for healing the Afghan community. My name is Ariane Mahmoud Ghazi. I'm an Afghan-American clinical social worker, and the journey that has brought many of our families of newcomers here is a journey that I undertook myself of some over 40 years, 30 some years ago. And I'm just kind of presenting this as a reflection on how it is that we actually welcome people into a new place, a new life. And I love the your suggestion and question, Jessica, as to how do we not only welcome the newcomers, but help them heal, adjust, and thrive. And it's been a difficult process to begin with. But there are so many similarities between Afghanistan and New Mexico, and we can get into more details with that as we go on to the next slide. I'm going to slow down a little bit. I've been really appreciative of the framework that was presented, but I feel like I just need to reflect a little differently. Because really the other part to just kind of developing a framework for what might be helpful is to really recognize relationship building. And I kind of found myself sort of like getting really interested in how to approach welcoming newcomers on a large level, but it's like really about slowing down. And so I work with Las Cumbres Community Services. We are not the main resettlement agency, that's Lutheran Family Services. We were just contracted by the Department of Health to provide assessments for the mental health portion of the Afghans that were welcomed into Santa Fe. And the peculiarity of our grouping of newcomers here is that we were not a site to begin with, and have just in the last 3 months had to just kind of unfold the presentation that is to follow. So basically, Las Cumbres is focused on the children. We provide infant and early childhood mental health services, community-based prevention, intervention, and reunification. And we have programs for immigrants from South and Central America and the border down south of New Mexico, and then most recently the Afghan Resettlement project here. So basically, we're talking about individualism versus collectivism, and it's really an understanding of the fact that any intervention recognizes the relationships, because what we're talking about is transforming the disruption that's come from generational trauma. And we can maybe move on to the next slide and the one after that. So who are our Afghan newcomers? Right now we have 12 families total, 50 people. The family composition is comprised of just different kinds of units of family. We have 2-parent households with anywhere from 5 to 7 children each. Some focused in, younger families, and then some families that span kind of like late teen to young adulthood. Then we have a few adult siblings and a few kind of families with just like a father, son. We have a grouping of Afghan men whose families were back in Afghanistan, and each of the families are representative of a particular configuration of ethnic groups and ranges of education and background and social class and worldviews. And so as we kind of get to assess and connect with people, we get to see what the dynamics may be and what we could be offering as programming. The most pressing physical issues have been prenatal care, number of kidney stone ER visits, diabetes, and eye and dental care. And in terms of the mental health stresses, of course, social and emotional isolation, deep worries about families left behind in Afghanistan due to the economic situation, but also due to worries about their family's safety now that they're not there. They've been evacuated and are settling into the United States. And of course, at 3 months in, we still have not found housing for 2 of our families, which has been such an issue, and I can get into that later. And really about finding work, but beyond work, a livelihood, something that kind of brings in some income and makes sense in terms of making use of gifts and talents and maybe past experience as well. Can move on to the next slide. So yeah, what we talk about challenges, they're shared nationally, but we're also focused on like what's particular to our community, which is what I'd like to get into very quickly. But basically language, education, particularly in Santa Fe, we have a big contrast between people who are more well-to-do and a large number of people who live in poverty. There's a high cost of living, housing, as we mentioned, making a living, and for us, finding a place together, to come together as communities, aside from just doing the home visiting and getting to know people and families one-on-one. So basically, we're focused on collaborating because we really need to do that. The kind of transition from the resettlement agency to our community has not been without its bumps, but we do seek to kind of really work with a tissue and weave of this community to respond to the urgent medical and dental needs and all of that, the most pressing issues, but also to set up opportunities for social gatherings and community building. And, you know, around like celebrations of Nowruz at the public library, where we had kind of children making kites, and we had like a whole kind of community education piece. We've celebrated during Ramadan a number of iftars on Friday nights, and we've had this final Eid celebration at in a mosque north of town. That is the most single important kind of community building piece that we've done. In terms of assessments, we've of course kind of spoken with the adults' family members, but we've also identified those families that needed, you know, to be connected through services for pregnancy, early intervention services, home visiting, Head Start programs. And then we kind of went into the school systems and developed joint interviews to identify this kind of curiosities and interests that skills that children had in relation to what the teachers might enhance. And then of course there are needs to support mothers, programs for youth, and also to support these men who in this particular configuration were farmers whose kind of lifestyle might not have been very different from about 400 years ago, who then kind of became soldiers and who are now finding themselves here. And we can go on to the next slide. So basically, it's as we're getting to know and understand each other, we're trying to see how best to kind of meet the needs for curiosity and for a sense of belonging and for the kinds of things that would encourage families. I mean, the greatest resiliency really has to do with families having managing to come here and just kind of start anew and really kind of focused on the welfare of their children. And so that's kind of a really wonderful entry point. So we can continue. So lately, keep in mind that all of this has been in the last 3 months. The first of our newcomers came 3 months ago. I myself started in this program maybe, when was that? Like the 10th of February. And so it's just been really a question of unfolding all of this. So basically, based on what we have identified in terms of getting to know people individually, we now have a place. We'll be meeting 2 days a week and 2 evenings a month. 2 days a week, we'll be on mornings, we'll be providing a skills development. It looks like some of the families have skills in sewing and weaving and upholstery. And there is also another grouping of people who've done cooking projects and are interested in catering and maybe prepackaged foods. We're getting the licensing for that. And then we've gotten a grant, and 8 of our women are going to be taking driving lessons. Very excited about it. Of course, cultural orientation, trauma first aid, mindfulness, emotional support, early childhood and parenting groups, money management, financial literacy, English as a second language. We'll figure out how to do all that within those 2 days, besides the home visiting. So that's for the mornings. And then the next slide will show us times. On the right here, you see this kind of flyer sort of cards that we created. Basically, programming for youth and men. Just from the initial conversations we've had, we've identified a need for getting together with a group of teenage girls, a group of mixed youth, you know, to help them kind of express how it is that they want to be involved in building this community, and some have just actually started talking about, like, they want to start a food truck business. They want to kind of really kind of step in. These are like teenagers and young adults interested in just stepping in for the rest of the community and having the resiliency to do so. And then men's programming, really, there so many people were farmers, and so we're looking at maybe, and this is appropriate to New Mexico, gardening, landscaping businesses, again, the basic skills, and then access to legal issues as well as really kind of finding ways to support them emotionally, because so many have been threatened with kind of being extorted for money for the safety of their families back home. And that's such a difficult issue to deal with. And so, meanwhile, it's just a beginning. I think we're coming together, and this is just a little clipping of our Ramadan celebration. A week from this past Monday. Just a little sampling of how we've come together in the last 3 months.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
This is KUNM. I'm Nash Jones. More than 2 billion Muslims around the world celebrated Eid on Monday, marking the end of Ramadan. The gathering of family and friends is usually a dressed-up festival of food, gifts, and charitable donations to poor families. But for the past 2 years, Eid was celebrated mostly at home or in very small groups because of COVID restrictions. This year, Muslim families from New Mexico and newly arrived refugees from Afghanistan gathered at the Dar al-Islam Mosque in Abaku for the first large Eid gathering since the beginning of the pandemic. KUNM's Yasmin Khan joined the celebrations.
After 2 years of small, isolated Eid celebrations, 11-year-old Hadiya Hadid was ready for a big party.
I feel fantastic because it's just nice to have all of us together again, to have like a reunion, I guess. I think it's just really nice with all the Afghan refugees that are here now, in order for them to have a good Eid, to make it a big one and special for them for the first time out of Afghanistan.
Built in the early 1980s by the Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih, the gleaming white Dar al-Salam Mosque stands out in the northern New Mexico desert. The swooping adobe arches and intricately carved wooden doors of the almost 20,000 square foot structure are unlike any other mosque in the world. Fatima Van Hatten grew up in the Muslim Abaku community, and many of the people who organized this Eid celebration are close childhood friends.
Islam, it has always been a part of New Mexico. As long as there have been Europeans here, and through colonization, they brought enslaved Muslims with them. And so the history of this country is intertwined with Islam. This isn't something that is exogenous to this place. It's not something that's foreign or external, like is often framed politically. And now we're welcoming newcomers like our family from Afghanistan.
Abdul Wahid, also known as Uncle Dumpling, came to New Mexico 3 months ago. A well-known chef in Afghanistan and Iran, he now works at the prestigious restaurant Martin in Santa Fe. He made hundreds of kebabs for the event. One of the event organizers, Jamshed Hadid, translated for Uncle Dumpling, who speaks Dari.
امروز آمدیم به خاطر اندوالا به خاطر عید فطر آمدیم اینجا برای کباب پزی کباب پخته کردیم یک کمک کردیم بسیار خوشی بود بسیار خوش بود تمام ملت اینجا تمام مسلمانا کباب پزی کردیم برشون.
I really enjoy it. We come here to just help for all this other Muslims here. My experience, because I'm as a chef in Afghanistan and I just cook some kebab here for all, and we enjoy it, all these friends and just the moments, happiness.
Martha Yazdani said she enjoyed seeing a wide range of Muslims at the celebration, including African, Arab, European, and Indian participants.
It feels wonderful. It feels safe, and it feels like everyone's partaking of it. Everyone are participating in some way, whether it's contributing something or just being present. But everyone feels happy and safe.
Martha, who's Iranian and speaks Farsi, translated for Safa, who only gave her first name, who arrived in New Mexico from Afghanistan 3 months ago with her 2 sisters and her mother. Although the women are still in need of stable housing in Santa Fe, Safa said they feel at home in the landscape of New Mexico, which is similar to the mountains of Afghanistan. She said Eid here is different than in Afghanistan, where there are fireworks and lots of family around. But she's excited to meet Muslims from around the world here and to have more freedom of movement as a woman.
ما بسیار خوش دارم مسجد برم انسانای مهربان ببینم همراهشان گپ بزنم مسلمانا را زیاد خوشم میاد و امروز همین کارا را کردم همراهشان گپ زدم نمازم خواندم.
She said that I love to go to mosque and to be with different Muslims and to pray together and to be in community together, and today I got to do that. I know it makes me want to cry. She said it makes me so happy that I got to pray with fellow Muslims and to be in community.
And how does that make you feel?
I mean, it obviously touches my heart because it's so special. Everyone should be able to.
The vast communal spaces of the Dar al-Salam Mosque have been relatively empty for the past few years, but this diverse Eid celebration has ended that fast too. For KUNM, I'm Yasmin Khan.
For more information, visit
Diane, not sure if you wanted to say anything in closing.
I think that I don't know why this comes up for me, but as we kind of share information, it's so important to find the rhythms through which this communication can be shared. I feel like we need to be able to slow down so that we can recognize different ways of communicating and understanding each other. And I think between kind of the theoretical frameworks and kind of the lived stories of people's experience, there's kind of a way to bridge and find the kind of timing that allows us to really embody who we are, how we connect, and what we share. That's what I'd like to finish with. I think with planting seeds, I think something wonderful is going to happen. I think that the resettlement of Afghans is really like just one of the ways that all of us are going to have to kind of come together around creating a different kind of relational society, so that we stop reeling from trauma and actually create something sustainable and beautiful. So those are my words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariane, for sharing your experiences and for sharing that clip around the wonderful Eid celebration. And so now with our remaining time, we wanted to move to our question and answer kind of portion. I know there have been a flurry of messages going back and forth in the chat as well, but also wanted to just give this space for some of our questions.
Giuseppe's going to help. Yes, I'm going to read a question to everybody. We have a question in the Q&A for the FSIR team from a participant. Is asking if there are any suggestions for working with young childless women who are here without their husbands. Anyone can answer this question?
I can weigh in. Mary, I don't know if you want to also add to this, and Farhad. On the IASC pyramid, we see the family strengthening intervention as working with any household that has a child that's school age, so 7 to 17. young childless women, there'd be lots of other areas within that PSS pyramid where either, you know, the social supports, being involved in some of the women's groups, like you just heard about New Mexico, or more specialized supports for those needing a higher level of mental care would be appropriate.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think particularly some of those group settings could be very valuable. Thinking about Ariane and her emphasis on relationship and just kind of normalizing difficult life experiences can be so powerful. May fall outside, yeah, what our particular family strengthening intervention gets at, but yeah, I think everybody's just acknowledging the need for a lot of variety, and that people enter into the system with different needs and different priorities, and that may shift over time.
Ariane, would love to hear if you have anything that you want to add as well.
You know, I'm kind of really inspired by a study that was done with Afghan social workers, and it was really about like identifying what constitutes wellness. You know, we've had like decades of kind of generational trauma, and it's like sometimes we conflate culture with trauma, the results of trauma, and so I think that that to really understand and make use of the best of the tribal system, which kind of has this long-standing memory that can actually override so much of sort of like incremental events of trauma. You know, there is like a tribal memory that is resilient, that has lived for a long time. And I think that making use of the kind of indigenous wisdoms that is inherent, paying more attention to that, and really kind of like giving them their standing, not as an adaptation to Western values, but as something inherently resilient that could actually lead to flourishing, because so much of Afghan culture is really the consciousness of a feudal system that had a reason for being. And it's like in the waves of history and how we need to metabolize different states of consciousness, this would make and create such a rich, amazing communication about like what really constitutes wellness anywhere, you know? And how do we then kind of like apply this to these frameworks in a way that we're not like beholden to kind of repeating the same strategies of cause and effect, but just really creating a garden, social environments of ecological, physical environments within our bodies that mirror an environment and relationships that we have with the planet, basically.
Thank you so much, Ariane. I'm just noting we had one question from Sangeeta around experience with unaccompanied children and youth. Would love to hear from our participants, and also want to note that that's something that we hope to hold additional sessions in the future, focusing specifically on unaccompanied youth, because I'm sure all of us on this call could easily spend a whole nother hour talking about that. But would love to hear from, as kind of our last question from participants, if there are panelists, if there are any experiences with unaccompanied children that you'd like to share about. I'm also noting we had another question in the last 60 seconds, which probably warrants much more than 60 seconds, but thinking a little bit about community, fear of community violence, or not feeling safe in new communities.
I just wonder about like the scale of things, you know, like we have a very small community and we have a very small kind of number of families, and it's kind of like we have many different cultures, and it's like harnessing the needs of Afghans, but also the needs of migrant children, also the needs of other people constitute a much larger umbrella. And I think awareness raising that we're not just particular separatenesses, but that we do have commonalities of being human that I think people can organize around and then come together around in community. I know it sounds a little vague, but that's the best I can do at this point.
I appreciate that, Ariane, and I recognize that we are at time, and while I'd love to continue having this discussion, I also want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so just want to send my sincere, heartfelt thanks to all of you who have joined today, to all of our panelists and partners on this. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. I know Marwa had shared in the chat a post-webinar survey. We encourage y'all to send us feedback. And we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and also with additional contact information and some of the articles and information that were referenced earlier in the presentation. So thank you all so much. And we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day and week. Take care.
Thank you.